The name of the shiur tonight is Dina D-Malchusa, Dina, an introduction. The reason why this is an introduction is because hopefully this will be the first of several that we deal with the issue of the law of the land as the law. And really for the very first discussion of this, we're going to be, and my primary resource for researching this is the Encyclopedia Talmudis, which hopefully many of you have in your own libraries. It's really, I think they're up to now volume 35 or 36. It started about 70 years ago, I think, but they've now committed to, they restarted the project a few years ago, and they're now up to, they're committed to doing at least one volume a year and hopefully 2 volumes a year. It's one of the big projects of Dov Friedberg, by the way. He's been one of the big funders, as well as the Rohr family. And so it's a source of pride for our community. In any event, Dina D-Malchusa, Dina, there's a lot to discuss. And one of the biggest questions any time we discuss Dina D-Malchusa, Dina, is, number one, what do you do when the law of the land is in clear opposition to Torah law? And number two, what is the scope precisely of Dina D-Malchusa, Dina? Does it apply only to governmental issues, meaning that you have to obey the rules of the land, to pay fealty and obey the laws specifically having to do with yourself versus the government? Or does it go beyond the laws of your obeying the, let's say, the speed limit and paying your taxes? Does it apply when you have a dispute between yourself and another fellow Jew, as far as contract law, as far as other financial dealings? So these are questions that we're going to be analyzing, mostly not tonight, but in a future discussion, the scope and the applications of Dina D-Malchusa, Dina. But by way of introduction, we have to understand where we get this halacha from. Or, to put it another way, what is the halachic mechanism by where Dina D-Malchusa, Dina comes into existence? It's not one of the Taryag mitzvahs. So on what basis did Chazal take it as a given that you have to obey the law of the land? There must be some basis for this. Well, we're going to learn we'll learn two very brief Gemaras tonight. And we'll take a look. There are many places in the Gemara where the principle of Dina D-Malchusa, Dina is mentioned. These are two very important citations. One is in Gittin and the other one is in Nedarim. And then, based on these two Gemaras, we're going to we'll launch into a discussion of 7 different reasons, or 7 different bases for the principle of Dina D-Malchusa, Dina. So we'll take a look first at the Mishnah and Gemara in Gittin, Daf Yud Amud Beis. The Mishnah over there says, Kol hashtaros ha'olim be'erkao shel ovdei kochavim, all contracts which can be produced in a court of law of the Gentile authorities, afal pi shechosmehem ovdei kochavim, even though the signatures on those contracts are Gentile signatures, which are not admissible in a Beis Din, because you need to have witnesses who are kosher eidim, and these are not kosher eidim, but nevertheless, kesherim. These contracts are kosher, they are binding according to the law. Chutz migite nashim v'shichrurei avadim. The exception to that is, if a woman is getting divorced, even if it's being presented in a court of Gentile law, nevertheless, in order for her to be halachically divorced, the eidim who sign it cannot be Gentiles. And the same thing is true with writs of emancipation when you want to free your Eved Kanani. Same thing. You need to have a get. You need to have a document which conforms to the halachic principles of the laws of Gittin. And therefore, if there are Gentile witnesses, it's not going to work. Reb Shimon Oimer, Reb Shimon continues along in the mission. He says, Af elo kisherin lo huskaru elo bizman shenasu behedrid. Reb Shimon disagrees. He says, even by Gittin and shichrurei avodim, you're allowed to use Gentile signatures as long as they're not commoners. Anyway, that's an opinion which we'll put to the side for now. But let's take a look now at the Gemara. The Gemara says, Kapasik v'tani, loshna mecher, loshna matana. The Mishnah seems to make no distinction as far as the legality of a contract that has a Gentile signature on it, independent of whether the contract is used to document the sale or whether the contract is used to document a gift. Now, conceptually, what is the difference between the two? Between a contract that documents a sale versus a contract that documents a gift. Can anyone think of the difference between the two?
One-sided versus two parties?
Okay.
Date and time?
Not necessarily.
Transfer of money.
Transfer of money. Okay, transfer of money is the crucial point. You see, when you're selling an item or you're selling real estate, even if the shtar that you're using is not kosher, but the transfer of money actually enacts the kinyan. It creates an exchange. So therefore, even if the shtar were not kosher, we could understand how a shtar is legally binding, because really it's only there to provide evidence of a legal kinyan that took place. But when a gift is made and a kinyan has to take effect, what if the shtar itself is the method whereby there's a transfer taking place from one party to the other? There's no money being transferred, so therefore the method of transfer is through the shtar itself. And there you would expect the shtar to have to conform to the legal requirements that are detailed in the Gemara, that a shtar has to have two witnesses on it, and two halachic witnesses, two Jewish witnesses. So there, that's the basis for the Gemara's question. Bishlam mecher, I can understand when you're selling property, then michiyahiv zuzi kamayu hu dekana. The legal kinyan, the exchange of ownership, is affected through the giving of cash, and as Rashi points out, ushtar raya ba'almahu. And there you can say the shtar is of less importance because it's only there to provide evidence of a kinyan that took place legally outside of the shtar. Di'ilo yahiv zuzi kamayhu lo havimaru nafshayu v'kaspen le shtara. He says, and the reason why the shtar is written is in order to provide evidence that cash was exchanged. If there was no exchange of cash, they never would have written a shtar to represent the sale. No one's going to write a bill of sale on a piece of property without the exchange of money. That's a fair assumption to make. Elo matana b'mai kakani. But what is the method? What is the mechanism of kinyan when a gift is being transferred from Reuven to Shimon? Love b'hai shtara. Isn't it taking place through the giving of the title? As I want to give one of my kids a car. Don't get your hopes up, right? But the way I would have to do it is, in order for the kinyan to take effect, is I'd have to give him the title on the car, right? Otherwise, either that or he'd have to pay me cash for it. But if he's not paying me cash, the only way that it can transfer ownership is by transferring the bill of sale or the title on the property to the other party. So lav b'hai shtar, v'hai shtar achas b'ba'almahu. And so how does that work if this shtar is not legal according to halacha? It's a shard of pottery. It's meaningless since Gentiles have signed on it and not halachically observant Jews. Amar Shmuel. Shmuel's answer is Dina D-Malchusa Dina. The law of the land is the law. And since the law recognizes two Gentiles' signatures on a contract as legally binding, as a legal contract, therefore it's legal for an exchange between two parties as well in halacha. Be'iba yisema, I'll give you another answer, says the Gemara. Tani chutz mi che gite nashim. Really what the Mishnah means, not it's all shtaros are kosher with Gentile signatures, except a get for a woman and a shtar shichror, and any other kind of shtar which needs to be affected according to halacha in order for the kinyan to take place. That's another way of reading it. So there's a whole dispute in the Rishonim and the Achronim as to how to learn this Ibayis Ema. Does this Ibayis Ema not hold of Dina D-Malchusa Dina? Or does it just suggest that we don't say Dina D-Malchusa Dina in some instances? All right, so that's a discussion to have down the road. But let's go on to the next piece of Gemara. So that's our first Gemara. It's the Gemara in Gittin. Let's go on now to our next piece of Gemara, Gemara Nedarim Daf Chav Zayin Amud Beis. There too we have a Mishnah and a Gemara. The Mishnah says, Nodrin laharagim ularachamonin ulamochsin shehi truma afal pi she'eno truma. Shehein shel beis hamelech afal pi she'enan shel beis hamelech. The Mishnah is basically saying that you're allowed to swear falsely in order to be able to save your skin. If you know of someone who's trying to confiscate property from you illicitly, or is going to kill you unless you surrender property, you can swear falsely that I would give it to you if I could, but it's truma. I can't give it to you, and therefore what do you want from me? And even if it's not truma, or you could swear that it's the king's property, it's already been designated for the crown, so I can't give it to you. Even if though that's a lie, you're allowed to make such an oath in order to save yourself or to save your property. And one of the categories of parties to whom you're permitted to lie is the tax collector. You're allowed to lie to the tax collector. Tax collector comes along. I don't want anyone to leave the shiur at this point. The tax collector comes along, right? You're allowed to lie in order to save your assets. So the Gemara says, "V'ha'amar Shmuel Dina D-Malchusa Dina." How can you lie to the tax collector? Isn't the law of the land the law? Right? And as the Ran, who's the running commentary in Maseches Nedarim, says, "V'heichi shorinan lemeider hachi kidei lihipater, kevin demin hadin chayiv litein lo asameches." How can you swear falsely to exempt yourself from that which you're legally, halachically obligated to pay? You're halachically obligated to pay taxes because of Dina D-Malchusa Dina. So how can you swear in order to get yourself out of doing something which the halacha obligates you to pay? So Amar Rav Chinana, Amar Rav Kahana, Amar Shmuel, b'moches she'ein lo kitzva. We're talking about a tax collector who has no set amount. Like the Ran explains, v'chivin shekein lav dinahu ela chamsanusa, v'chamsanusa d'moches lav dinahu. We're not dealing with a regular tax collector who follows a tax code and charges you that amount that you owe. We're talking about the sheriff of Nottingham, right? If you know the story of Robin Hood, who would basically come to your house anytime the coffers were running low and would basically squeeze you for everything that you had in order to be able to satisfy the crown. So therefore, this is called chamas, this is called a violent extraction, and that's not din. That's not din. In other words, if you can make the argument that the government is a corrupt government that is not fairly collecting taxes, and again, I know there'll be some who will try to make that argument, but it doesn't apply to either Canada or to the U.S., at least not presently. You never know what will happen the next 2 years under Obama, but who knows? But in any event, so therefore, it's not considered to be your halachic obligation to pay those taxes. Devei Rabbi Yanai Omar b'moches ha'omed me'elav. Rabbi Yanai in his brisa says that we're talking about a tax collector who's representative only of himself. He's not representing the government, and that's why it's not an issue of Dina D-Malchusa Dina. So here we've seen two Gemaras which take it as a given that Dina D-Malchusa Dina. We've also observed that there are limitations to Dina D-Malchusa Dina. In the first case, in the Gemara in Gittin, you can't apply Dina D-Malchusa Dina to a get, even though the law of the land recognizes two Gentile signatories as legally binding. That doesn't apply to a get and other things that are similar to a get, where Isser Veheter is at stake, not just financial issues. And we saw Gemara Nedarim that says that it's understood that Dina D-Malchusa Dina, when you have an obligation, or do you want to just go outside, tell them the rabbi requested silence, please. Thank you. So the second Gemara Nedarim observes that Dina D-Malchusa Dina applies to paying of your taxes. But there too, there are limitations when the government is tyrannical and is not being fair in its tax collection. Okay, so when we look at the Rishonim and the Achronim, we find a number of different explanations as to how Dina D-Malchusa Dina works, on what basis it works, and why it's taken as a given by Chazal. So I've divided it into 7 reasons, which we'll go through tonight, Mirz Hashem. Reason number 1, that whenever you live in a foreign country, there's a tacit acceptance of the king's authority. And it's on that basis that you understand implicitly that you're living in a country that's under someone's rule, and you accept the authority of the king and the king's right to legislate law that you implicitly, tacitly accept upon yourself to follow. It doesn't have to be said expressly, but it's understood. And this is what the Rashbam says in Bava Basra, Daf Nun Dalid, also where the Gemara discusses Dina D-Malchusa. And here the Rashbam says, V'amar Shmuel Dina D-Malchusa Dina. He says, Kol masim va'ar, this is in source number 3. He says, Kol masim va'arnoniot umin hagot shel mishpatei melachim. All taxes and levies and other customs that are imposed by the government, sheregilam lahanhig b'malchusam, that they place or that they impose in their rulership, dino, that is the law of the land. Shekol b'nei hamalchus mekablam aleim meritzonam chukei hamelach u'mishpatav, that all of the subjects of the kingdom tacitly accept upon themselves the rules that the king imposes upon the land. V'hilkach din gomerhu ve'ein lamachzik b'mamon chaver al pichok hamelach hanohuk be'ir mishum gezel. And therefore, it's the law. So if the king says that according to my rules, that guy is entitled to your assets, so that's not gezel if that guy is a yid and he takes hold of your assets, because the king basically has made that the rule of the land, that he, in this particular circumstance, he's entitled to your whatever it is, and therefore you can't argue that the halacha says otherwise, because when you chose to live here, you chose to live by the rules of the king. You accepted that. You said, I will accept whatever the rules the king imposes upon me. Okay? That's explanation number 1. Is that any time we live in the country of Canada, the province of Ontario, we live here by the good graces of the king, and we basically have tacitly accepted upon ourselves and our families that we will observe the laws of the land, and it's on that basis that the king or the crown allows us to live here. Okay? Reason number 2. The owner of the land can kick us off any time, because really there's something called eminent domain in halacha, at least according to this explanation, which basically says the king can confiscate, the government can confiscate any land. By the way, we rely on this concept of eminent domain when we build Eruvin. We do this all the time. The reason why putting a physical barrier around a town or a township or a city allows us to carry is because really, according to halacha, you have to go to every Gentile that's included within that enclosure and rent space from him. You have to give him a pruta and ask him to get his express permission to be able to use that area for carrying. So on what basis do we not do that? We don't in the GTA, we don't have to go to millions of inhabitants of the GTA and give each one a quarter or a dollar and ask them if it's okay for us to carry inside the Eruv, which is part of their domain. The reason we don't do that is because we go to the mayor or to another city official who is duly recognized, could be the chief of police, and we say to him, you have rights of search and seizure, you have rights of eminent domain. And therefore you are considered to be a fair representative of every single inhabitant, because you have rights to actually go in and confiscate or enter their property at any time. Therefore, if I give you $1, chief of police, it's as if you are acting on behalf of every single person that's inside the Eruv that I want to be able to carry in. So this is a real concept in halacha, and it's the very mechanism that we use to enable us to carry on Shabbos. I remember I did this in Pennsylvania when we built the Eruv there. Went over to the I think it was the chief of police we went to, and we gave him $1. And some of the chiefs of police, they take the silver dollar and they frame it on their wall. So the Ran says this very same idea. He says, "B'moches ha'omed me'elav." Remember that Gemara in the Doran said that if you're dealing with a tax collector who's not representing the government but is really just doing it on his own, then it's not Dina D-Malchusa Dina. Shelo b'mitzvahs hamelech. He says, then the Ran says, the kasva b'tos was the dalfka b'malchei ovdei kochavim omer de Dina D-Malchusa Dina. We only say Dina D-Malchusa Dina when you're living in a foreign land, when you're living somewhere out in diaspora. B'mdei sheha'aretz shelo, because the land belongs to the king. V'yachol lahem im lo ta'asu mitzvosai. And the king can always say, listen, these are my rules. If you don't follow my rules, agaresh eschem min haaretz, then I can kick you off this property. Aval, I can deport you, basically. Aval b'malchei Yisrael, lo. But when it comes to Jewish kings in Eretz Yisrael, we do not say Dina D-Malchusa Dina, Lefisha Eretz Yisrael Kol Yisrael Shutafin Ba. Because in Eretz Yisrael, every Jew is an equal partner in ownership of the land of Israel. V'chi amrinan Dina D-Malchusa Dina, Hani mili li'inyan she'im kana echad mechazeh chayavim litein lo es hameches. He says, when do we say Dina de Malchusa Dina? If the king gives a certain individual the rights of collection of the tax, which was the medieval practice, the king would say to one of his subjects who had, let's say, slain a dragon or done something else amazing for the kingdom, he would say, okay, your reward is you get to collect tax from the province of Buckingham or wherever Nottingham or wherever it is. So, v'chein nami im lo kana oso ela shehu memuna legabos hameches she'eno rasha Yisrael chaber lisha b'shem truma deleka unsa kevin dedina demalchusa dina. And similarly, if he's just appointed for that purpose, no one can swear falsely to get out of paying the tax because he's been appointed by the king. The tax rightfully belongs to him. And anyone who doesn't pay the tax is not obeying the rules by which the king allows you to live on his property. So this is what we would call the eminent domain argument. Now, what's fascinating is that the Ran says that Dina de Malchusa Dina does not apply in Eretz Yisrael. That's a very controversial statement. I remember, this is one of the oldest halachas I remember learning once I went to yeshiva in Eretz Yisrael. I think I learned this halacha when I was 17 years old. You know why? Because yeshiva bachrim were often fond of quoting this to justify how we could utilize the black market to sell our stereos that we brought, our ghetto boxes that we brought with us. The kids don't even know what ghetto boxes are today. But the ghetto boxes that we brought with us from Chutz La'aretz, the JVCs and the Sonys and the Panasonics that we brought with us, and we would sell them. And so, so one of the frum guys, one of the Alter Bachim would say, but come on, Rabbi, it's the black market. Look, but the Ran in the Dorm says, no Dina de Malchusa Dina. What are you talking about? Show him the Ran. Come on. Only Am Haaretz would say Dina de Malchusa Dina applies in Eretz Yisrael. And that was the justification when you wanted to. The world has changed since then, but back in the day, everyone, if you brought dollars with you to Israel and you changed it on the street with some guy named Moshe, right? Or you went to the bank and you had to pay some exorbitant fee for exchanges. Everyone remember that? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what was the justification? There's no Dina de Malchusa Dina. Look at the Ran. It's the favorite. There's no Dina de Malchusa Dina. Of course, the Ran is 1 out of 7 reasons for Dina de Malchusa Dina. There's a whole bunch of other reasons that Dina de Malchusa Dina does apply in Eretz Yisrael as well. But just keep that in mind.
Well, on the issue of eminent domain, though, how do they do an eruv in a town in Eretz Yisrael?
You have to go to everyone?
I guess you have to argue.
A place like Haifa, which is only half Jewish, let's say.
Right, that's a very good question. I guess you have to argue that there's still eminent domain in the sense that there's search and seizure rights, that the chief of police has the right to go in. And if in case of an emergency, he can force everyone to evacuate, I suppose. Maybe. It's a good question. I don't know. But that would be my guess. Okay, reason number 3. The ruler, this is probably the most bizarre reason I've been able to find. The ruler of the land is considered to be the owner of every person who lives there in the sense that we are all subjugated to him as slaves. And as such, just like a master can demand of his slave to do whatever he wishes, so too a king can command his subjects to obey the rules of his land and do whatever they're obligated to do as a slave. And it's based on the following Gemara. It's in Yavamos Daf Mem Vav Amud Aleph. Amarle Rav Papa LaRava Chazi Mar Hani Devei Papa Bar Abba Diyaha Vizuzi LeInshi LeChargayu UMishabdi Behu. He says there were people in the house of Rav Papa Bar Abba that what they would do is they would pay the tax, the head tax, for a group of people who lived in their area. These people were poor; they couldn't afford to pay their own head tax, so Papa, the house of Papa, was wealthy, and so they would go ahead and pay the head tax for those people, and they would say, okay, now that we've paid the head tax for you, you have to act as our slaves, either permanently or for a finite amount of time. So when it was time to dismiss them after they had worked, for a certain amount of time, were they considered to be mamish avadim, Or would it be, or they're not literally avodim? The nafkaminas be when you have to write a writ of emancipation to free them, a get shichur, or do you not have to write a writ of emancipation? So Amar Lei, so Rabbi says back to Rav Papa, Iku shechivi lo amri lechu hamilsa. Hachi Amar Rav Sheish. It's a good thing I haven't died yet, Rabbi said, because if I had died, because Rabbi was quite elderly, and he said, if I would be dead now, I wouldn't be able to tell you that which Rav Sheish has taught. Muharkaihu dahani, meaning Rashi says, their chasimos of shalelu betafsa demalka manach shehin lola avadim. That sort of like their names are in the king's chest. That the king has a roster of every single subject that lives in his kingdom, and they have the status of being his slaves. Umalka Omar, and the king therefore says, Man de lo yoiv karga mishtabe laman de yoiv karga, that whoever does not pay the head tax becomes the slave of someone who does pay the head tax for them. And therefore, yes, Taka, you would have to write a get shichur once this person works for you. And after they've worked off their debt, you would have to write a get shichur for them. So the simple understanding, the way Rashi learns, is that these people that the house of Papa would pay the head tax for were Gentiles. They became avodim kinanim, and they had to be emancipated through a get shichur. But that's not the way the Rashba learns. The Rashba learns in source number 7. He says as follows: V'ilavda mistafina amina de Yisraelim ninu. He says, if I wasn't fearful of saying so, I would suggest that these were talking about Jews who couldn't afford to pay the head tax, and the house of Papa paid the head tax for them. And that's why the Gemara says that they would make them work even more than appropriate. And the Torah says you're not supposed to enslave someone unnecessarily. But the reason why the house of Papa rationalized it, even though they were Jews, is because they were not savory people. And he says, it's under that condition that these people are coming to live in the king's land. We're coming to live in your land under the condition that you get, our name goes in your chest, it goes into your treasury, and we are your slaves, your majesty. And it's as if the king, anyone who comes to live in this area, in this geographic area where the king is the king over, it's as if the king has acquired these people as booty in a war, or spoils of war. And the king therefore owns them. As it says that the 4 kings who fought against Avraham took, actually this pasuk is in Sefer Bamidbar, Vayish mimenu shevi, that a captive of the Jewish people was taken. And therefore, if I offer to pay the head tax, it's as if I've purchased that, through my payment of the head tax, I've purchased that privilege of owning that slave that the king owns. And therefore, and therefore you have to write a get shichur. So the way the Rashba learns, it's got no difference whether the person that you're paying the head tax for is a Jew or a Gentile. By virtue of the fact that they are the king's slaves, by living in his land, you must therefore, if you pay the head tax, they become your slaves, and therefore you have to emancipate them formally by writing a get shichur. But it turns out, the way that some of the Achronim learn, according to this Rashba, this explains the mechanism of Dina D-Malchusa Dina. The Dina D-Malchusa Dina works because not only am I tacitly agreeing voluntarily to obey the rules of the king, not only can the king confiscate my property or deport me if I don't obey the laws of the land, but I'm actually subservient to the king. I'm actually, in a sense, the king's slave or vassal, and I'm forced, therefore, to do his bidding based on the fact that he, in some way, has some kind of ownership of me by virtue of the fact that I live in his country. So we don't think about it this way. No one would ever suggest that as a subject of the province of Ontario, the government owns me, but that's the way the Rashba looks at it. Yes?
Wasn't Rashba thinking of a king who was a autocratic leader, we remove, and the premier of this province is nothing more than a representative of us. We can remove her or him at any time.
Well, the argument would be, so you're saying in a democracy, does government have the same power as in a monarchy? I think, well, this is a democratic system is really what we have is a republic system, where we have elected officials who do legislate law and make decisions for what the law of the land should be. We don't have the ability to decide what the law should be. If we're not happy with a governmental body or group of politicians, we can always vote them out of office after they serve their term. But during that time, they do have the status of, they do have the autonomy to make law. So therefore, I guess in a sense, maybe though you can't identify one particular ruler, but the body politic, so to speak, really is the authority of the land. Okay, but that's a good point. Perhaps you would argue that this argument would not hold of Dina D-Malchusa Dina in a republic. Yeah.
So how does the Rashba see the exception in the Gemara in the Darim, where the exception to Dina D-Malchusa Dina is b'muchas she'ein lo kitzvah? Because if you hold that to the slaves, then you should have to pay anything.
That's a very good question. I guess at some point, even a slave does not have to obey his master if the master is being unreasonable. Perhaps that's the way the Rashba would learn. I don't know. Reason number 4. The ruler has the din of a melech. And we know that a melech has certain privileges, as is recorded in not only the psukim of melech, but if we want to know what rights the king has as far as what he can take and how he can rule his kingdom, we look at Sefer Shmuel Aleph Perek Ches. When Shmuel was trying to discourage the people from taking a king for themselves, he told them, well, look at all the terrible things that a king can do. He can make the people's lives miserable. So it says in Perek Ches, starting with Pasuk Yud Aleph, he says, Vayomer zeh yihyeh mishpat hamelech. Asher yimloch aleichem es b'nei asher yimloch aleichem. This will be what happens when a king is ruling over you. Es b'neichem yikach is going to take your children. The samlo b'merkavto v'farashav. He'll make them a part of his entourage and part of his runners. The ratzu lifnei merkavto. He'll force your children to act as the runners before his chariot. The lasumlo sarei alafim v'sarei chamishim. He'll make them his officers of the thousands and of the 50s. He'll force them to farm on his land. And he'll force them to manufacture all of his chariots and his weapons of war. He'll take your daughters as spice makers, as butchers, and as bakers. He'll confiscate your fields, your vineyards, your olive orchards, and he'll take all of those wonderful things and will give them to his subjects. And anything that you do produce, he'll eventually tithe and take for himself. And he'll give them to his soldiers and to his servants. And he'll confiscate your servants, your young men, your donkeys. He'll take all of these things and say that he needs to inscript them for the service of the king. He'll tithe your sheep and you'll become his servants. So you see that a Jewish king is given certain privileges. By the way, there's different ways to learn this pasuk. Some learn this pasuk as Shmuel was really exaggerating the scope of a king's power. But others learn that no, Shmuel was actually fairly reflecting upon the rights that a king has in order to run government. And therefore, on this basis, the BAYT says that based on these psukim, he says in source number 9, he says, "V'gabai hamelech shematbeo yotze shegoven davar shehu chokeik lakol eno gazel the Dina D-Malchusa Dina." He says if a gabai, if a representative of the king, and the king is recognized as the senior authority of the land, and these gaboyim confiscate or collect items on behalf of the king, that's not theft. He says because Dina D-Malchusa Dina, Kid Yalfinun Mikroi, the mishpat hamalucha kidenelef behilchos melachem b'siyata dishmaya va'afilu melech goy. And the chiddush of the Mabit is that don't think that these descriptions of the scope of a king's rights apply only to a Jewish king, they apply to a Gentile king as well. So according to the Mabit, the basis for Dina D-Malchusa Dina are these psukim in Sefer Shmuel, which talk about the rights that a king has. So that's reason number 4. Let's go to reason number 5. This is a very interesting halacha having to do with Shiva mitzvos b'nei Noach. One of the 7 mitzvos of b'nei Noach, the 7th of the 7 Noachide laws, is that a king has an obligation, or a government has, of any Gentile province, has an obligation to make laws, to enforce the other 6 Noachide laws, and to make rules, to create a civilized, law-abiding society. It's one of the reasons the Rishonim say that that was the justification for Shimon and Levi to wipe out the city of Shechem, because they saw that there was complete lawlessness in the land. I believe that's the way the Rambam learns, that there was lawlessness in the land, and it was on that basis that they felt there was no observance of the Shiva mitzvahs of the 7th law of Dinim. And it was on that basis that they wiped out the kingdom. So the Even HaAzel, which is Rav Isser Zalman Meltzer, who lives into the 20th century, he's got his commentary on the Rambam, and he writes as follows in source number 10. He says, "V'nira dihine matzinu dina D-Malchusa Dina, rak gabe meches." He says, Rav Isser Zalman says, that the sources that we've seen so far generally speak about tax collection in the context of Dina D-Malchusa Dina. The Amrinan Demoches Yisrael Shekana HaMeches also ligzol mimenu ulavkia HaMeches. That if the tax collector is Jewish, there's no justification to take the money back from him or to deny him the collection of the money. V'chein Amrinan Dina D-Malchusa Gabi Kinyanim. Demasha Amar HaMelech De Kinyan Ze Yo'il Mo'il Umitam Dina D-Malchusa Dina. We also find that when it comes to what is considered to be a legal transfer of property, that also can be defined by the king. Od matzinu din zele inyan aveda la'achar yeyesh shekasav harama b'choshen mishpat simin b'choshen mishpat, and I guess there's a word missing. Demikiven dika dina D-Malchusa lahachzer aveda la'achar yeyesh mechuyav al pi din lahachzer. The Rama writes in Choshen Mishpat that even though Jewish law does not require you to do the mitzvah of Hashavas Aveda after the owner has said Yeyush, after the owner has already given up hope of retrieving it, but if the law of the land does require you to return a lost object even after Yeyush, then you're required to do that. V'tzarech levoyer v'taima, d'lama davka b'hani inyanim matzinu dina D-Malchusa Dina. So Rabbi Isser Zalman asks, why is it dafka in these examples do we find that Dina D-Malchusa Dina applies, that the law of the land is the law? He says, V'im neima, perhaps we'll suggest that the be'emes lav dafka. He says, really, Dina D-Malchusa applies in so many other cases as well. Im kein chas v'shalom, batlu kol dinei haTorah, v'lo tehei kazos b'Yisrael. Well, if that's the case, then all the Torah laws will be thrown by the wayside. I mean, are you going to suggest that if the government says that you have to work on Saturdays, that there's no more Shabbos? Of course not. So the question always becomes, what is the scope of Dina D-Malchusa? We only see in the Gemara that it has to do with tax collection, paying your taxes, and laws of what mechanisms work for transferring property. The Shach, which we'll learn about down the road, tells us a general rule. He says anytime there's an opposition between Dina D-Malchusa Dina and Torah law, we always go with Torah law. And here's another example. The Gemara says that if I know that a Jew owns a Gentile money, I'm nevertheless not allowed to testify in a Gentile court before the crown. The only reason why I'm allowed to testify is that their method of legal execution will be no different from if it was in a Beis Din. But if, for example, my testimony would cause the court to conclude that the Jew has to pay the Gentile the money without making him having to take a shvuah, then I wouldn't be allowed to testify, because we don't say Dina D-Malchusa in that situation when it's in opposition to Torah law. According to Torah law, if there's only one witness that shows that Reuven has to pay, Christopher, then Christopher can take Reuven to Beis Din, and he can have the witness testify. But the Beis Din would have Reuven take a shvuah if he wants to, in order to exempt himself, or would at least have Christopher take a shvuah to be able to extract the money. But in a situation where if I go to secular courts, they won't require a shvuah, they'll just automatically paskin based on my testimony that Reuven has to pay Christopher the money, then the Gemara seems to say over there, says Rabbi Zalman, that I'm not even allowed to testify, because I'm causing a miscarriage of halacha. So you see, v'im kein sarach lovar lama davka b'hanach mahani dina D-Malchusa. So you see, even with monetary law, sometimes we don't say Dina D-Malchusa Dina. So what is it about these that where we do say Dina D-Malchusa? V'nira d'mashikas of Rashi da'al hadinim nistavu b'nei doach hu chad taima im Dina D-Malchusa Dina. He says Rashi tells us that even the non-Jews have a set of laws that they have to abide by called the Shiva Mitzvahs B'nei Noach. Rashi is telling us that that actually is the reason why Dina D-Malchusa Dina. Because there has to be a government, that's one of the laws of Shiva Mitzvahs B'nei Noach. There has to be an establishment of government that sets up laws. V'hainu dekivin de B'nei Noach nitztavo ladinim, u'memela yachal hamelech lasos takanos mo'ilos l'tikan hamedina kemo shechayv yoshvei hamedina b'mas l'tikan hamedina. He says once the king is allowed to make takanos mo'ilos, he's allowed to make laws and statutes and ordinances that will help the establishment of a civilized society, it now becomes incumbent for everyone to be able to support that establishment of law, that rule of law. And that's the reason why, because you want, even though I'm Jewish and I'm not governed by the Shiva Mitzvahs B'nei Noach, but if I'm living in a Gentile society, then I have an obligation to make sure that the Gentile society as a whole is abiding by Shiva Mitzvahs B'nei Noach, which requires me to abide by that law as well. Okay, and therefore he says, "V'yesh lefarish lefi daitam zal da'afal gav dekayim Dina D-Malchusa Dina ki mavor be'perakei mehilchos kazei levaveda hani mili b'mashu hu to'eles lamelech be'inyanei hamisin shelo mashu hu mechukav aval b'dvarim shebein adam lachaveiro ein dino bahem din." This has a very, the way that Rabbi Zalman is explaining it, it has a very important ramification. Anything which does not affect the governance of a civilized society really is not under the province of Dina D-Malchusa Dina. So if there's a private deal that two people make between the two of them, then that deal has to be governed by Shulchan Aruch and not governed by Dina D-Malchusa unless it's explicitly stated otherwise. Because whether or not we abide by Shulchan Aruch or whether we abide by Dina D-Malchusa will not affect the governance of our society. Only those things which will affect directly the governance of society, such as paying taxes and returning lost items, whereby the king wants people to be good Samaritans, and so forth. So those are things that affect the general society. Those are things that are governed by Dina D-Malchusa. And it has to do with Shiva Mitzvahs B'nei Noach. So to me, this is a very, very interesting, very curious kind of explanation. I'm a Jew. I'm not governed by Shiva Mitzvahs B'nei Noach. But because I live in a Gentile society, I have an obligation to uphold so that the Gentiles among whom I'm living can abide by Shiva, the seventh commandment, the seventh Noachide law of the establishment of laws. Yes?
I mean, he doesn't go as far as to say that Jews should not be seen to be keeping a level lower of law than the Gentiles.
No, it's just different. It's just different. It's a level...
If you don't respect the law of the land like we ask the Gentiles to do, would that be seen?
Yeah, but if it's something private between two consenting parties, then and we didn't stipulate what law will prevail over a particular kind of deal between the two of us, then according to what he's saying is that since it doesn't affect the governance of the community or of the society. We should utilize the Shulchan Aruch.
Well, I appreciate that. I'm just talking about the broader laws, not the man, like sort of the laws of the land.
The laws of the land. Yeah.
But is it for that reason? Is it?
He's saying it's for that reason, because of the seventh Noahide law. That there has to be a set. God wants all Gentiles in the world to have communities that are governed by the rule of law. And therefore, anyone who lives within that society has to abide by that rule of law in order to uphold that desire of Hashem.
And in practicalities, we probably don't do that. Except for once in business and you invoice another Jew, you're going to put in on the contract, 2% net 10 or something like that, and that might be ribbies or it might be. I mean, we just treat everybody the same in the way we contract business.
Well, ribbis is a serious problem. You can't rely on Dina D-Malchusa Dina to override the prohibition of ribbis. That's one of those things. You see, ribbis is not even in Choshen Mishpah. That's not even financial law. Ribbis is in the realm of Isser Veheter. And so it's like, when you charge ribbis, it's like you're eating chazer. So it's something that if the government says that today is Chazer Day, that we can't say that Dina D-Malchusa Dina permits me to eat chazer. We intuitively know that. And so even Rabbi Zalman's definition is not going to allow us to trespass the other mitzvahs of the Torah. And ribbis would be included in that. The only point that I'm saying is that if there's no violation of, let's say, changing the rule of law, let's say, for example, if a contract is considered to be legally binding when Gentiles sign, and in halacha it's not considered to be legally binding, so then, if it's something that could be brought to, that would affect the governance of society, so then you have to abide by Dina D-Malchusa. Obviously, we have to go through the applications, but at least we're seeing conceptually that this is reason number 5. This is another reason why Dina D-Malchusa Dina is known to be of importance. By the way, I should mention to you that the Rishonim also discuss whether Dina D-Malchusa Dina is a din d'Rabbanan or a din d'Oraisa. Most say that it's d'Oraisa. And certainly based on what we've seen so far, certainly this reason would indicate that it's a d'Oraisa law. Let's go to reason number 6. Reason number 6 is the status also based on a pasuk, but here it's a different pasuk. The king is given a certain status based on a pasuk in Shir HaShirim, and it refers specifically to Gentile kings once again. In Shir HaShirim it says, Kerem hayali Shlomo beval Hamon, that King Solomon has a vineyard in Baal Hamon, somewhere in Jerusalem. Nasanes hakerem lanotrim, and he's given the vineyard to the watchers. Ish yavi befiryo elef kasev. Each person will bring the equivalent of 1,000 silver pieces with his produce. Karmi shali lefanai. My vineyard is in front of me. Ha'elef lecha shalomo. That 1,000 goes to you, O Solomon. Umasayim lenotrim espiryo, and 200 to those who watch over his produce. Now, very cryptic psukim, but Rashi tells us that metaphorically this is referring to the Jewish people living among the Gentile nations. Kerem hayali Shlomo, Rashi says, Zu Knesset Yisrael. This refers, the vineyard that King Solomon has refers to the Jewish people. Nasanas hakerem lenotrim, that when it says that King Solomon, which is the representative of God, it says that he gives the vineyard to the watchers, Masruliyad Adonim Kashim, Bavel Mada Yavon Ve'edom. That God gave over this vineyard, the Jewish people, over to very harsh and very stern taskmasters. Bavel, Mada, Yavan, Edom, those who subjected us to persecution in the Golus. B'medrash Shir HaShirim Matzasi Miktzah Smach Al Notrim Halalu Shehem HaMalchuyos. And I find that the Medrash supports this idea. Ish Yavi Befiryo, each person will bring his produce. Kolomar, Kol Ma Sheyachlu Legabos Mehen Gulgolios Va'arnonios Va'an Paros HaKol Gabu Mehem Lahavi L'Soch Beisam. These kings, who are the watchers over the Jewish people, each one of them collects taxes and duties from the Jewish people, and they bring it into their homes. Karmi shali lefanai, and yet Solomon, which represents Hashem, says, I'm watching over the whole process. Liyom hadin yivim HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'mishpat, v'yomar karmi afal pisha masartiv b'yedchem shalihu. That in the very end of days, when God brings judgment upon all the other nations of the world, He's going to say, the vineyard, the Jewish people are mine, and I gave them over to you to watch. And I know every single penny that you confiscated from the Jewish people. and not even a penny is unknown to me of what you confiscated from the Jews. Behem omrim ha'elef l'cha shlomo, elef ha'kesef shegavinu mehem ha'kol nachzir. They say we'll give everything back. Umasayim l'notrim espirio va'od nosif harbi mishalano v'nitein lahem l'rosheim v'chachameim. And we will pay back the Jewish people in spades. We'll give back everything that we took from the Jewish people when they were in Galus, and we'll even give more to them, to the wise men of the Jewish people.